Maganda yan.
Amen. Magandang gabi po.
Magandang gabi po.
Magandang gabi po. Magandang gabi po.
Ang pag-uusapan po natin ngayon ay archaeology. Anong relationship nito sa biblical text? At titingnan natin kung paano magkakaroon ng harmonization yung Biblia at yung archaeology at the science. Okay po. Lecture 10. Archaeology in its relation to the biblical text. Preliminary discussion. Scripture is not a science book or manual. It is an expression of a faith community. These two views are not comparable. Science may be treating about the how. The Bible may be discussing about the why. So, what happens when the faithful is confronted with findings of the sciences about the situation in life during the biblical times? Without a proper perspective of these two realities, there is a great chance that, confronted with seemingly incontrovertible scientific findings, the faithful may find themselves in a crisis about the apparent conflict. Canons, norms, or standard. In every profession, there is a canon or standard that is being followed. In law, we have the various codes. That means the Civil Code, National Internal Revenue Code, etc. In the medical profession, we have the various scientific disciplines like cardiology, family medicine, urology, otolaryngology, and the like. In the accounting profession, we have the standards. It means IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standard, the IAS, International Accounting Standards, IAS, International Standard of Audit, and the like. In education, we have the various standards and methods of teaching, and even according to the level. That means goals of the schooling, standards being the what of education, curriculum being the how of education. If we look at each of these professions, it is imperative to note that the standard of one profession cannot be applied to the other. Otherwise, there will be confusion, may even be harmful to society. Imagine a doctor in the operating room consulting the National Internal Revenue Code to assist them on how to do the operation. Archaeology. Archaeology is just like that. Disciplines such as geology, stratigraphy, which through the years have accumulated and grown looks at the human production by way of stones, utensils, and the like, and are used to enrich the present understanding or knowledge of the experiences and achievements of human predecessors. The various methods, digging, collating, interpreting, are used to formulate a hypothesis on the perceived chronology of events, data, and the like, for a better appreciation of the past. To arrive at a scientific conclusion, or even hypothesis only, the canon of the profession requires its application to the facts, artifacts, pottery, papyrus, and propose a coherent understanding of its production and how it affected the human predecessors. Biblical studies, hermeneutics, exegesis, biblical theology, systematic theology. These disciplines study the textual, compositional, and historical questions surrounding the Old and the New Testament. The norms of biblical studies lay the groundwork for meaningful interpretation of the Bible. As previously indicated, this discipline needs the various canons necessary for proper interpretation. In the section for biblical hermeneutics, the necessary tools have been outlined and discussed. Thus, in order to understand the meaning of the text, the various methods, procedures, and accumulated interpretative results should be taken into account. Interdisciplinary studies. We cannot therefore apply the canon for archaeology to that of biblical criticism. They have disparate and different focus for their subject, and thus the interpretative nuances will also be different. What we can do, however, is to have an interdisciplinary collaboration in order to enhance the finding of one so that the other, taking into account the canons of each, and respect each of the results as belonging to their respective discipline. Faith seeking understanding. Quote, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. Hebrews 11, 1-2. By our profession of faith in the creed, we have the assurance of the things hoped for. Now, there are two possible avenues to understand this faith perspective. One, knowledge-seeking faith. Can we attain to faith by way of knowledge? Can knowledge lead us to faith? This could be a very hard thing to do. Number two, faith-seeking knowledge. Through this, we can exert the effort to understand our faith by way of understanding what the various sciences have to offer. The sciences. Appreciation of scientific findings. When confronted, therefore, with the findings of science, are we to disregard our faith because of the findings of science? The findings of science are facts, an appreciation of factual evidence. How the scientists explain it could be hypothetical, for want of a better explanation, or it could have been determined as scientific proof already. We have to consider them as valid hypotheses or proof. When we apply the canon of the scientific finding, say archaeology, our base should be a specific set of criteria. Thus, the findings of the science should be viewed from the perspective of these criteria. Never look at the criteria of literary analysis to explain the scientific findings of archaeology. Appreciation of literary analysis. On the other hand, the scripture has been a literary fact which have come down to us for several millennia. That, too, should be considered as valid proof of the existence of this literary fact. The exegetical, hermeneutical explanation of the literary analysis are the findings for the study conducted under this discipline. As the caution we had for the findings of archaeology, we should provide the caveat not to explain this explanation using the canon of archaeology. Every which way decision? With the canon applicable to the specific findings, we find two sets of valid proofs. We cannot do an either-or choice. Chances are our understanding of either of them may be the invalid one. By choosing to view each finding against its applicable criterion, we would positively be able to understand the findings more aptly. Thus, given the criteria of science and given the validly recognized proof of the scientific fact, we have to accept the same. However, if the scripture says in its literary presentation a different understanding, it is not the literary presentation that is invalid, but rather its present understanding. And so, this literary presentation has to be polished in order to bring our faith to the better understanding of the circumstances surrounding the Sitchin Leben. This way, we would be able to appreciate the scientific fact presenting itself more fully in relation to the literary analysis. The scripture should be understood in the context of the circumstances wherein they are written. The scientific findings should be understood in the context of the scientific reconstruction that the field, example, archaeology, presents itself. The maximalists and the minimalists. We have said the scriptures were written during the exile. It is good to know, however, that there are scholars who espouse differing concepts of the unit circumstances when the scriptural texts were composed. There are scholars called maximalists who say that the biblical texts are first composed during the period of the United Kingdom. In this perspective, David is seen as the character of Genesis. Other scholars called minimalists say that all biblical texts were written by priests and scribes during the exile down to the Hellenistic period. Hypotheses. There are different hypotheses about the composition of the Hebrew scripture. A well-known hypothesis, the documentary hypothesis articulated by Julius Wellhausen, indicate four sources. J source uses the name Adonai from Judah. E source uses the name Elohim from Ephraim. And D source, the book of Deuteronomy. And the P source from the priests. This hypothesis is under scrutiny by various scholars. One of them is Umberto Casuto, who proposes an alternative and new edifice based on the extensive tradition of the Jews, not otherwise incorporated in the final form of the Torah, as the features thereof. The documentary hypothesis is by far more stable, and until such an edifice shall have been erected, this hypothesis may yet provide a coherent basis. The Bible and Earth, a minimalist perspective. In their book, The Bible and Earth, Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman propounded the idea which at first glance can be thought to be contrary to the biblical text. However, in their clarification, they have accepted that the Bible as a tradition cannot be supplanted by whatever archaeological findings they have found. Rather, it has a life of its own. Yet the Bible's integrity and in fact its historicity do not depend on dutiful historical proof of any of its particular events or personalities, as the parting of the Red Sea, the trumpet blast at the top of the walls of Jericho, or David's slaying of Goliath with single shot of his sling. The power of the biblical saga stems from its being a compelling and coherent narrative expression of the timeless theme of a people's liberation, continuing resistance, oppression, and quest for social equality. It eloquently expresses the deeply rooted sense of shared origins, experiences, and destiny that every human community needs in order to survive. What they seek to present is an archaeological storyline that is in accord with the findings of the archaeological diggings. Their story may differ from the biblical story, but it is not because one is wrong, but the basis of understanding its story is different from the other. Among the salient, controversial, and archaeological stories they presented are as follows. Number 1. The Amorite migration did not happen. Thus, the migration of Abraham from Ur is part of the faith tradition rather than the archaeological one. From the biblical perspective, however, the figure of Abraham becomes the center of the unity of that group of people. Number 2. Moses is also part of this faith tradition story rather than that of the archaeological findings. From the biblical perspective, however, this figure serves as the bridge between the various groups of people. See the Jacob cycle, unifying the confederation into a strong unit of people. Number 3. There is a dramatic discrepancy between the biblical account and the situation in Canaan, as suggested by the date of the conquest. From the biblical perspective, the story of the conquest is presented as a liturgical presentation. Number 4, the Israelites, rather than a group of foreigners conquering the area, are Canaanites themselves. Number 5, the first archaeological verifiable personage is David. A stela was found where the words House of David is identified. The presence of David in the biblical tradition more or less validates both the biblical and the archaeological stories. Number 6, the so-called United Monarchy centered on the South has no archaeological basis. Rather, Jerusalem was a modest village. The biblical account could have been a literal representation of an idealized state. A reading of the Bible unearths archaeologists' new vision of ancient Israel and the origin of sacred texts by Finkelstein and Silberman could elucidate on these differences. In a documentary film about this book, some of the better ideas presented by the author and their other sources, persons, are the following. Number 1. Archaeology and science can now for the first time begin providing the answer. Why should we want to unravel the story of the Israelites in their Bible? 1. Because they invented this idea of a single God. 2. Because they invented written history. And 3. Because they invented the idea of the individual with rights and responsibilities that lies in the heart of Western civilization. Number 2. Can stories which are not true in every detail nevertheless be morally edifying? The Bible is set up to be literally true in every detail, to be true in other senses. Number 3. From their own complex and difficult history, the Israelites have written a document that is still influencing the world. Number 4. Despite all the controversies, what we are doing is creating that archaeological story that goes in parallel with the still very profound and cherished biblical tradition. Number 5. What we are trying to do, what we wish to do is not to discard the biblical text, but to make a distinction between tradition, which is important for all of us, and scientific research. Number 6. Tradition is important. Archaeology cannot touch that tradition. Archaeology cannot destroy that tradition because tradition has a life by itself. Number 7. We are not saying that one is correct and the other is incorrect, any more than we can say that the poetry in Genesis is incorrect. Number 8. Quote, to me, that's a miracle, unquote, in reaction to the millennia of writing of the scripture, and yet is very profound. Yan po yung presentation natin ng archaeology. Mamaya, may ipapakita ko yung sinasabi doon ng mga resource persons. Ipapakita natin yung video clips, 3 area, from Abraham to the Canaanite entry into Palestine, and then the development, reconciliation, and then the in a sense para bang harmonization nung pinag-uusapan natin. Yung mga nandoon sa text na nakita ninyo will be found in this in this presentation. So pakinggan po natin para meron tayong basihan sa pag-uusapan.
Master, nawala po kayo.
May problema? May problema po ba?
Meron po, nawala po kayo.
Sige.
It is written, it's very important, but what we hope to do is to share the information that has been collected for the first time with the public
Okay na po.
to perhaps create a very more complex understanding of what the Bible is and what it actually says, and perhaps at least cause people to understand that there's a lot more to the biblical history than just occasional quotations used for very tactical religious, political purposes.
The Old Testament tells the story of the Jews' ancestors, the Israelites. It says their history began with a family of nomads who migrated down from Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, to Canaan, modern Israel. Their leader was a man called Abraham.
The Lord said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee.
That land was Canaan, and according to the Old Testament, God promised it to Abraham and his descendants forever. This is the origin of the idea of the Promised Land. For the best part of a century, archaeologists have tried to prove the Abraham story by finding evidence of appropriate migrations at the times suggested by the biblical account.
All this theory from A to Z of a migration from the north is not accepted anymore today. I mean, it was a nice theory, but there's no backing. I mean, the people of the beginning of the second millennium BC, they are all from a local stock. So there was no migration from the north that you can relate Abraham to.
The general portrayal of nomadic life in the Bible doesn't really reflect very strongly what we know about nomads. Nomads are often plunderers. They often invade settled territories. There's reference to camels. The camel nomads come in much later. They are not characteristic of this period.
After arriving in Canaan, Abraham and his family supposedly settled here in the city of Hebron. This building, the tomb of the patriarchs built by King Herod 2,000 years ago in Roman times, is supposed to stand above their burial site.
What we can see here, the main building is Roman, from the Roman period, probably Herodian. You see the big stones. Above them are much later Muslim mosque. But what is most important for our aim here is the bedrock here. This is the natural bedrock from the time of the Canaanite period, from the time of the settlement period, and so on. And in this bedrock, you cannot see it here, but all around, in this bedrock, were cut tombs during the Canaanite period. This was the cemetery of the town, here around. So this is the source of the tradition, which is not historical, about the patriarch Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that are so-called buried here.
So do we have any actual evidence that Abraham and his family did at least exist?
there is no historical Abraham in the strict sense. There are traditions about Abraham. What we read in the Bible are later traditions which have almost nothing to do with real history. Probably there was an ancestor of the tribes here named Abraham, but we know nothing about him but his name.
The patriarchs could have been real figures who became mythical during the ages. They could have been completely mythical. We don't know, and we'll probably never know. In fact, there's no way to know.
We've come to a complete archaeological dead end about Abraham. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Abraham was a historical figure. But he is a prominent character in the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis is an ancient text that is, of course, of incredible importance for us. And what we see in the figure of Abraham is a symbolic representation of the birth of the nation. Because at the time of the writing of the Bible, the history of the people of Israel was not considered to be history in the sense that we understand it, of years, of periods, of particular historical events. It was seen more as the history of a family. And of course, the father of the family, the founder of the family, is a person of great significance.
Although we can appreciate the importance of a mythical figure like Abraham, the complete absence of any objective evidence, indeed the inconsistencies in the biblical account, inevitably weakens the claims made for it. According to the Bible, famine drove Abraham's descendants away from Canaan to Egypt, where they ended up as slaves in the Nile Delta. After many tribulations, a leader amongst them, a man called Moses, led them out of Egypt. They headed eastwards, back towards Canaan, the promised land. This famous journey forms the basis of the Old Testament books of Exodus, Neil Silberman has come to discuss the evidence for the Exodus with Donald Redford, one of the world's leading archaeological experts on Egypt's Delta region.
Some kind of food preparation.
We know from the archaeological monuments and the inscriptions that in the 13th century, there was tremendous power in the Egyptian empire. How can you explain the possibility of such a large group as described in the Exodus story actually going out of Egypt? Is that possible?
Well, I couldn't explain it if I subscribe to that theory. What you said is quite correct. Egypt, in fact, for 5 centuries, from the 15th century on, Egypt ruled an empire, the largest at that time, which extended 2,000 miles as the crow flies from a little north of Khartoum all the way to near the Euphrates River. And the Egyptian army and occupation forces and its economy were extremely strong. They held all of Canaan, of course. Their sphere of influence extended to the Greek islands and Crete. And there is no indication whatsoever in the records, either archaeological or written, of any major hiatus, such as would have been created by the expulsion of upwards of 2 million people, if we believe the biblical record. That would have made such a hole in the population. It would have brought the economy to a standstill. It would certainly have turned up in the record somewhere. Now, that's an argument from silence, I understand, but nevertheless, the silence is absolutely watertight. There is no indication whatsoever.
The Bible also says that after leaving Egypt, Moses and the Israelites wandered for 40 years through the Sinai desert on their way back to Canaan. It was here that Moses received 2 tablets of stone bearing the famous 10 Commandments, which still today include some of our most basic moral norms. This is also where the Israelites apparently agreed to give up the worship of idols for the worship of God, and just the one God, alone. But could such a journey have been at all feasible?
All over the eastern delta and in the Sinai and up in the Negev and further north, there were permanent Egyptian garrisons and garrison points, checkpoints. And we have records, the letters that were sent back and the reports of such police on the comings and goings of wandering peoples. Certainly, there would have been no chance whatsoever for a group of people that large to move freely through the desert and into the Negev. Not a chance at all. Moreover, that would be the height of folly to go south into that inhospitable, barren land with mountains everywhere and little water and less food supply. The story simply doesn't fit in so many ways.
And there's an even bigger problem. Throughout the entire period in which the Bible places the Exodus, Canaan was in fact an Egyptian province, ruled by Egyptian governors. We know this because we have extensive Egyptian records from Canaan and a wealth of archaeological evidence. This is Bet Sha'an in Israel. Beneath these Roman ruins, archaeologists discovered it had been a powerful Egyptian garrison in biblical times.
It signifies Egyptian control over Canaan in the late Bronze Age. If you want to understand the way the Egyptians dominated completely the country and the countryside, you have to come here. There was a strong garrison, there were scribes here, there were soldiers here, there were administrators here, and everything was under the control of the Egyptians, which means that 20 kilometers from here, 30 kilometers from here, if somebody wanted to take some sort of a major economic decision or a major political decision, he needed to come to Bet Sha'an to get the approval of the Egyptians. They were the masters of the countryside.
So it makes no historic sense for Moses to have led the Israelites to Canaan in order to escape the Egyptians. But what about Moses himself? Surely there must be some evidence for this most famous Old Testament hero. Moses is perhaps the most famous of all Old Testament figures. Even if there's no evidence of the Exodus, there must surely be some record of a leader as important as him.
The name Moses is a name which is very popular from early periods right down into late periods. So it's a fairly common Egyptian name. That's all that we can say. There is no text in which we can identify this Moses or that Moses as the Moses.
The question of the historicity of Moses is the same as the question of the historicity of Abraham. That is to say, maybe there was a figure, maybe there was a leader. I am not here to undermine the historicity of Moses. I think that it is possible, but I would say it's beyond recovery.
Perhaps the best way to make sense of the story of Moses and the Exodus is to understand that there was constant movement between Canaan and Egypt in ancient times.
We can't be sure if there was one incident in the hundreds of years that Canaanites came down to Egypt that more or less represents what we have in the story of the Exodus. But the experience of going down to Exodus, of being involved in Egyptian civilization, of freeing themselves from the rule of the Pharaoh happened again and again.
This is Mount Nebo in Jordan. From here, according to the Bible, Moses looked down on the promised land of Canaan, but died before he could enter it. It fell to Joshua, apparently, to lead the Israelites across the valley and to take Canaan by military conquest.
And it's a wonderful story, a great saga of war and conquest and bravery and miracles. And the question is, did it happen? Did it really happen the way it is described in the text of the Bible, of the book of Joshua?
The Bible says Joshua and the Israelites embarked on a 7-year campaign, during which they conquered 30 Canaanite cities. Without doubt, the most famous story is that of Jericho. In fact, distinguished British archaeologist Dame Kathleen Kenyon established 50 years ago that the walls of Jericho were destroyed many centuries before Joshua's time, probably by earthquakes, and that there was virtually nothing there in the conquest era.
The conclusion is, when we look at Jericho, Jericho was not inhabited in the 13th century BC probably. And then anyway, there are no fortifications. So where are the big walls of Jericho? I mean, you have this wonderful description of the people of Israel going, with the Ark of the Covenant, with the trumpets, and then the walls of Jericho collapse, in the seventh day. All of a sudden, there's nothing there. So this is not history in the simple sense. And the case of Jericho applies also for other places mentioned in the tradition of the conquest in the book of Joshua. Many of the cities mentioned were not inhabited at all in the late Bronze Age. There was nothing there.
But there are some archaeologists who part company with Finkelstein and Silberman. One of the cities mentioned in the Bible as having been conquered by Joshua and the Israelites was inhabited and was destroyed at the appropriate time. It's Hatzor in northern Israel, and Professor Amon Ben-Tor is in charge of excavating it.
Look at that. That's the destruction of the entire palace. If you look over there, we go towards the southern wall, we find ourselves in the throne room of the palace. So we are in the throne room. Look at the cracked basalt stones. Look at this. Normal heat doesn't do this. Only a very, very intense fire. Look at what is happening on the walls. See the ashes, see the wood, signs of the timber here, on the walls. Wherever you look, wherever you go, same signs of destruction. In the case of Hatzor, we see undoubtedly a violent destruction, like in no other place. And the question which faces us is, when did it happen and who did it? I believe that by now we can say rather safely that the destruction of Hatzor, the big final destruction of Hatzor, occurred sometime in the first half or towards the middle of the 13th century BC. And the question is, who is responsible?
The destruction of Hatzor coincides with a period of great turbulence in the Middle East. This is the temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt. At this time, mysterious people who came from the sea and are known as the Sea People attacked Egypt and many parts of the Egyptian Empire. They also attacked Canaan. Later, they settled on its coast and are known in the Bible as the Philistines.
There was a collapse of the Canaanite system and Egyptian administration in Canaan. It didn't come, in one overnight. It was a long process, which probably took almost a century, from the beginning, from the collapse of the first cities to the later ones. And much of it must have been done, or must have been related to the assault of the Sea People in several waves, possibly, on the coasts of Canaan. So slowly by slowly, the cities of Canaan disappeared. Some of them must have been destroyed by Sea People in the 12th century. Some of them could have been destroyed by reaction of Egypt. Some of them could have been destroyed by rivalry between fighting each other. Some of them could have been taken by those groups on the margin of the Canaanite society.
Professor Ben-Tor believes that such a group did destroy Hatzor, and that since the Bible names them as the Israelites, why disbelieve it?
Nowhere in any document in Egypt does it say that the Egyptians destroyed Hatzor. So I think we can rule out the Egyptians. Let's go back to the Canaanite city-states. Which one of the Canaanite city-states was big enough to compete with Hatzor? Which one could have destroyed Hatzor? I don't know of any such city-state. I'll rule them out. Let's go to the Sea People. They have a very, very distinct pottery. We did not find even one shirt which is Philistine. Not one. Add to this the fact that it is too far inland. The sea people were coastal. This is where their interests were. Not so far inland as Chatzor. I'd also rule them out. It turns out that we are left with those enigmatic Israelites or proto-Israelites. They were the ones responsible for Chatzor, and that the traditions that are preserved hundreds of years later in the book of Joshua have a nucleus in the reality of the destruction of Chatzor.
So it might have been the early Israelites who destroyed Hatzor. But that one fact hardly vindicates the whole Old Testament account of the conquest. So why did the story come to be composed in this form?
The way the story is written, putting the conquest of the Promised Land into a single military campaign with a unified strategy to conquer the center of the country, the north and the south, is clearly a later attempt to explain how the Israelites conquered the Promised Land.
As one might expect, the conclusions of archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein arouse fierce controversy, even within the archaeological profession.
If the Rahov dates are correct.
Here, Professor Finkelstein is in Los Angeles, taking part in a heated debate.
All kinds of retelling and editorializing and writing.
A major issue currently dividing archaeologists is the Old Testament portrayal of what happened after the conquest.
Don't talk, it's my turn. And we have
The Bible says that once the Israelites had established themselves in Canaan, a great empire eventually arose over all their people. This unified empire was supposedly established in the 10th century BC by David, he of David and Goliath fame. His capital was at Jerusalem, which is why it's known as Royal David's City. And after King David's death, he was apparently succeeded by his son, Solomon. The heroic biblical portrayal of this dynasty has always made it seem a kind of golden age for the Israelites. For once, as far as David is concerned, we can actually say with confidence whether he was real or not. A stele is a stone tablet bearing an inscription. In 1993, archaeologists excavating here at Tel Dan, a northern outpost of the Israelite kingdom, found a fragment of a foreign Aramaic stele from the 9th century BC, which refers to King David by name.
When you look at what is written there, in the 9th row, 1, 2, 4, 6 of the letters make up the name which can be read Bet David. It's the first time that the name of Bet David, or David, as the father of the kingdom of Judah, is mentioned in a source which is extra-biblical, not something that was written by the Bible author, but something from the 9th century BC. And it's the first time that the name David is mentioned. It's unique, and it tells you that it could be that David was an historical figure, or at least people in the 9th century thought of him as their founder of their kingdom.
So it seems David was a real person. The Bible says that his capital was Jerusalem. It mentions large armies and important public buildings. But Professor Finkelstein is skeptical of this portrayal, because present-day archaeology doesn't support any idea of Jerusalem being a big city at that time. Ronnie Reich is currently excavating the site of 10th century BC Jerusalem.
A pocket here, a pocket there, maybe in other places which Canaan has found. But for this particular period is not yet enough to say even, I think, the nature of the site. Is it a huge urban city? It is definitely not.
In the ancient part of Jerusalem, there's a curious stepped structure. Some archaeologists think this might have been part of David's fortifications.
In my view, David's Jerusalem was a kind of a citadel city. It doesn't mean that he had a huge city around him. The city was quite small, but he probably gained a lot of political power and somehow succeeded to control the entire country in a time when there was a gap, there was a kind of a vacuum, political vacuum in this country. There was no Egyptian empire anymore. The Canaanites were very poor, and probably he took advantage of this situation.
But even this modest view of Jerusalem is hard to reconcile with the archaeology. Ronnie Reich and Professor Finkelstein are descending into the bowels of the city. It seems Jerusalem at the time of King David was only sparsely inhabited.
So much has been excavated here in the area, and nothing has been found, no stones, large stones of, let's say, 10th century, no pottery. Pottery which is found everywhere, and if people were active in this place, they might have left something behind, must have left something behind, so that here the negative results again and again and again simply prove the point.
The idea of a great Davidic or Solomonic empire in the 10th century BC is absolutely ridiculous, because an empire needs a capital. There's almost nothing in Jerusalem, a very small village. An empire needs manpower. There's nothing in Judah, a few small villages. An empire needs administration. There's no administration, there's no scribal activity. Where is the empire?
Many archaeologists remain unpersuaded by Professor Finkelstein. They point to David's son, Solomon. He is famous in the Bible for his wisdom and judgment, and for having been the builder of the first great Israelite cities. The Bible mentions Hatzor as one of the cities Solomon built. The Canaanite city was indeed rebuilt in the 10th century BC, and Professor Ben-Tor can see no reason to doubt that it was Solomon's work.
How can we be sure, and I'm talking only about Hatzor now, how can we be sure that these fortification, that this gate were built by Solomon? We cannot be sure. There is no building inscription said, I, Solomon, built this building. But what we can be sure of, and we checked it again and again and again, by means of stratigraphy, by means of pottery typology, we can be sure that these were built in the 10th century. And since the Bible tells us that it was Solomon, now you don't have to ask me, how can I tell that it was Solomon? It's common sense. If you want to say it is not Solomon, it's you. You tell me why it is not Solomon.
Traditional archaeology also supported the idea of Solomon as a great builder, because at the two other sites mentioned in the Old Testament, Gezer and Megiddo, they found characteristic six-chambered gates, just as at Hatzor. This was taken as evidence of a common Solomonic origin.
What you're seeing now is the famous six rooms gate here in Gezer, the so-called Solomonic gate. It's hard to see because of all the vegetation and everything, but you can still see the main pass in the middle, and then 1, 2, 3 rooms to one side, and 1, 2, 3 rooms to the other side. You still see the beautifully worked stones at the entrance. There is a similar gate in Hatzor, and there is a similar gate in Megiddo. And these three gates were thought to be, because of the passage in the Book of Kings, these three gates were thought to be the gates that Solomon built, the blueprint of the Solomonic architecture. It doesn't fit because there are gates like that also in other sites, which are not Solomonic in any way. Ashdod, it's a Philistine city. Tel Batash, it's on the border between Philistine and Israel. There's a later gate in Lakeish. So it's like, let's say, it's more like a fashion of the Iron Age gates than something that single out Solomonic building.
This is the similar monumental six-chambered gate in Megiddo, found in the 1930s and also assumed to be Solomonic. On the basis of the archaeology, we can tell that the Israelite palace which stood here was quite an elaborate and sophisticated building. Now, modern radiocarbon dating tests are being conducted to try and establish the exact date of the palace. The results of the tests are not conclusive, but they point strongly to a date about a century after Solomon.
This is the new data together with the old data. And the one thing you can see is that the new data is consistent with the previous one. So we didn't change the picture, and that's great, because you don't want each time a new data comes, the picture to be changed completely. And moreover, it supports the picture, because this red point, which is the new one you just brought here, is nicely consistent with the low chronology and fairly far away from the high chronology. So objectively, that's what we expect. So great, things fine.
The low chronology, pointing well after the 10th century BC, makes Professor Finkelstein and Neil Silberman doubt whether a great empire could have existed at that time.
Look, it was a wonderful story. It got people excited and really interested in the Bible, but we just can't accept the story of the Solomon's Gates anymore.
For many reasons. First of all, right there from the beginning, there was a problem. Because when, you look at the report, at the archaeological facts on the ground, the gate is definitely later. It must be put somewhere in the 8th century or something like that. But beyond that, today we know that there are gates like this all over, later than the 10th century, in the 8th century, and even in the 7th century, and beyond the borders of biblical Israel.
But some archaeologists think there may well be something in the biblical account. This is Thebes in Egypt. The great temple of Karnak records the history of the pharaohs and of the great Egyptian dynasties. One of these inscriptions refers to the military exploits of a pharaoh called Sheshonq I. It details the blistering devastation that he visited on 150 towns and villages in Canaan in the 10th century, the supposed Solomonic era. Uniquely for an Egyptian campaign in Canaan, Sheshonq's forces turned inland from the coast and attacked towards the highlands where Jerusalem is situated.
We have to ask ourselves, what is the reason for such a pharaoh in the 10th century BC to invade the central mountains, the hills, which were forested and were hard terrain to reach for a military campaign, Egyptian military campaign? I think that this is a good hint that there was some political entity in this region. And this political entity, in my view, can be identified with this united monarchy, which probably threatened the Egyptians, or they saw in it some kind of threat, political threat or economic threat.
So the evidence, archaeological and textual, provides a very contradictory picture of 10th century Canaan. There may have been some kind of Israelite entity, but it seems highly improbable that it could have been the elaborate empire portrayed in the Bible.
It's confusing. The highlands of the south are very sparsely settled. There's no manpower for great Davidic conquests. In Jerusalem, it's a small village, nothing monumental, no real evidence for big capital.
Despite the biblical evidence.
Of course, no evidence for a great Solomonic capital ruling over a great state, rich state, and so on. And here at Megiddo, the buildings, the monumental buildings which had been described as the symbol of Solomonic greatness, in fact, date a bit later. They don't date to the time of Solomon, they don't date to the 10th century. So we are in a situation of a complete negative picture, negative evidence from coast to coast.
So what had been connected with Solomon and used as an illustration of his greatness is later, and we have to rethink the whole situation.
Yeah, we do.
It seems some of the early Old Testament stories may contain glimmers of real history, so they're unlikely to have been simply made up and invented. Equally, many key events cannot have happened the way it says they did. So how do we make sense of this unevenness? Israel Finkelstein has come here to San Diego to discuss this with one of the world's leading authorities on the Old Testament, Professor Richard Friedman.
The situation with the Bible is not just that it's a very old book, but there's a tremendous difference from the oldest part of the Bible to the youngest part of the Bible. So the first sentence in the Bible, whatever that is, was written 1,000 years before the last sentence in the Bible. And in between, there's maybe 100 or 150 authors living in this century, this century, this century. And so even when you know Hebrew, you learn it's a different Hebrew all the way through it. Even when you think you understand one of the authors of the Bible, but there's another author of the Bible who sees things differently. So people say it's not a book, it's books. It's not a book, it's a literature, it's a library. People use all these metaphors to try to capture the idea that the Bible is this amazing collection over so much time.
Professor Friedman is passionate that we need to know the Bible's origins in order to understand the way it portrays history.
If you can know where the book came from, who the author was, why it made a difference, then you understand how it came up with the particular conceptions of God that it did, why it came out telling history the way it did. It's everything that we think is so great about the Bible. We try to find out through this search, why is it so great? How did we get this book?
Archaeology and science can now, for the first time, begin providing the answer. It's a largely new and unfamiliar story, markedly at odds with the Bible's own account. But why should we want to unravel the story of the Israelites and their Bible? Because they invented the idea of a single God. Because they invented written history. Because they invented the idea of the individual with rights and responsibilities that lies at the heart of Western civilization. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we all owe an immeasurable debt to that impossibly distant group of people. So who were they actually? How did the Bible come to be written? And how did they bequeath us this extraordinary legacy? As we've seen, contrary to the Old Testament, there's no evidence for any migration from Mesopotamia at the supposed time of Abraham, said to be the Israelites' founding patriarch. We can't rule out the possibility that some nomads may have come to Canaan. But modern archaeology suggests that rather than being outsiders, the people who later became the Israelites were simply part of the pre-existing Bronze Age population of Canaan.
The people of the beginning of the second millennium BC, Middle Bronze Age, and also the people of the Intermediate Bronze Age in the third millennium, late third millennium BC are all from a local stock. So there was no migration from the north that you can relate Abraham to.
In effect, the Israelites appear to have simply emerged out of the local population. When is difficult to say precisely. What we do know is that throughout the Bronze Age, that is up until about the 13th to 12th century BC, the land of Canaan consisted of a number of Canaanite city-states. Though Egypt ruled the whole territory, the city-states enjoyed considerable self-government.
City-state is a term that we use for the political organization of this country during the Canaanite period. The country was divided into about 30 city-states. This is quite a small country. Each state had a territory of about approximately 1,000 square kilometers, and each city-state capital had a local kind of king, a petty king we may call it, small king. He had a palace, he had his courtiers around him, and some noblemen and so on. There was some hierarchy in the city, the craftsmen, the priests, and the common people. And he had a group of small towns and villages in his territory. So this organization of city-state is very common in the Levant, in Palestine, in Syria, during the Bronze Age.
The Egyptian control of Canaan lasted about 300 years. but the attack of the Sea People from the late 13th century BC, which led to the collapse of Egyptian rule and the slow destruction of the Canaanite city-states, unleashed tremendous regional instability.
The entire Eastern Mediterranean was in a complete turmoil. The economy was disrupted. Maritime trade routes were cut. Ports on the Mediterranean coast were destroyed, were attacked and taken. In a situation like this of economy falling, famine, political dysfunction, then one city can attack another. A gang of people from the highlands can take a city. Pastoral nomads can come also and try to gain some advantage by attacking a single city, isolated city. Everything was in chaos.
No one really knows why this happened. But out of the anarchy, destruction, and dislocation came a development which was to have the most profound consequences for the whole Western world. It was nothing more extraordinary than that poor, backward, and illiterate desert nomads were forced to start farming in this unpromising terrain. But in time, this particular group of people were to achieve something remarkable, to establish kingdoms and a scripture, and to invent the idea of a single God. These poor, backward, illiterate nomads became the Israelites. The well-watered valleys of the northern highlands ran down to the coast, and so geography encouraged trade and prosperity. In due course, a more complex society arose.
The population grows. There's hierarchy between the settlements. There's intensification of the agricultural activity. There is industrialization of the agricultural output. There is specialization in grain growing and olive oil production. All this shows that we are on the way to statehood. There's this development which leads to statehood, and all this happens in the north.
Slowly, but unmistakably, this northern area became a recognizable kingdom. It was called Israel. This was the Israelite city of Megiddo. From this period on, we can be fairly confident about events. The Bible itself probably began to be compiled quite close to this period, so it's more reliable. We have detailed diplomatic records from neighboring territories like Assyria. And we now find far more material facts on the ground.
Concerning Israel, we have very interesting archaeological evidence and very convincing archaeological evidence for the development of the kingdom. Samaria, the capital, is founded in the 9th century. The same in Jezreel, the other palace. All this confirms the Bible very well, because the Bible tells us that Omri founded Samaria, and Ahab built also Samaria as well as Jezreel. So concerning the northern kingdom, Tel Dan, Megiddo, Chatzor, Tel Rehov, all these sites really give us a beautiful picture.
And so the northern kingdom of Israel grew apace. Former Canaanite cities destroyed in the Great Chaos were now rebuilt as Israelite centers. But in the southern highlands, it was a different story. This area was known as Judah, and it was here that Jerusalem was located. But one can see, even today, that this terrain was much less promising than in the northern kingdom of Israel.
As you can see all around, it's a highland area. It's the highest in the central highland of Israel. It's the most remote area. It's the poorest area. Not too much rain, not too much good field for agriculture. There are, but less than in the north.
In the 10th century, the south is still very sparsely settled by just a few small villages. And Jerusalem itself is only a God-forsaken, small and remote village. There's almost nothing there.
But despite their differences, the people of both Israel and Judah were one and the same.
In the north, the much richer area with a richer environment, with cities, with trade routes, it naturally became a powerful kingdom. That's the kingdom of Israel. In the south, centered around Jerusalem, was a kingdom based on the same principles, but because of its environment, because of its low population, it was much economically weaker. It was more isolated. And yet the two kingdoms had a relationship. They sprang from the same origins, from the same historical period.
As time passed, the southern kingdom of Judah slowly became more densely populated, and agricultural development slowly increased. By the 8th century BC, Judah, like Israel in the north, was also becoming a developed state, with all the panoply of administration and bureaucracy. Literacy was the vital precondition, and pottery remnants of the period testify to this key development. The development of Judah was extremely fortunate, for just as it was becoming a proper state, Israel in the north was facing a mortal threat.
After the 9th century, the period of greatness of the Kingdom of Israel, in the 8th century, decline sets in because of the pressure from the north. The Arameans, the Assyrians move down. Eventually, in 732, they take the Galilee. And that's the beginning of the end of the Kingdom of Israel.
One by one, the northern cities were overrun, and bit by bit, the kingdom expired. Thus ended a state called Israel. It was to be 2,700 years before another state bearing that name would arise again in the Middle East. But Judah survived. According to the archaeology, large numbers of people now began arriving in the Judahite capital, Jerusalem. About 10,000 people suddenly descended on the city in the late 8th century. They were almost certainly the people of Israel.
Judah of the late 8th century was not at all similar to Judah of 30 or 40 years before. And that was because of the torrent of refugees who came from the north after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, came to Judah and settled here. Judah was completely transformed from a small, sleepy kingdom to one of the most influential kingdoms in the Levant. And that is the first time that we see a real, full-blown state.
These are the ruins of Lakeish, Judah's second city. In 701 BC, after overrunning the northern kingdom of Israel, the Assyrians came south and began to attack Judah, then ruled by an important king called Hezekiah. As both the Bible and Assyrian records testify, the Assyrians razed the city to the ground after a prolonged siege. The death of Josiah in 609 BC at the hands of the Egyptians seemed the end of all Judah's hopes.
And now everything is ruined. The Egyptians have power over the country. In the east, Babylon becomes a great power, and they have power over the country. Things continue to go worse to worse. And first there are 3 different sons and 1 grandson of Josiah who get to be the king. And finally, the last one of them is King Zedekiah. The Babylonians come under the great emperor Nebuchadnezzar. They surround Jerusalem. They defeat it. They march out all of Zedekiah's sons, and they execute them one by one in front of him. And then they put out his eyes, and they put him in chains, and they take him back to Babylon.
With the elite of Judah removed to Babylon and Jerusalem devastated, the kingdom was destroyed, and the remnants of the population left scattered and leaderless. But the Judahites taken to Babylon managed to preserve the memory of their religion and history. Jerusalem, or Zion, remained central to their thoughts.
It was a complete catastrophe. It could have been the end. So it's really interesting that at that time, the only hope, the only way to keep the identity and the tradition was around, the old stories.
Their mood was captured in a poem from the Book of Psalms.
By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. On the poplars there we had hung up our harps, for our jailers asked us to sing them a song. But how can we sing a song of the Lord in a strange land?
In spite of their despair and the incredible odds against them, the Judeans decided to fight for their survival as a people. They chose to fight not with spears and swords, but by writing a book. In every spare moment they could find, the greatest of the Judean scribes began to rewrite and edit together stories about their past, which had been handed down to them by their ancestors. The book they compiled was the first edition of the most influential work in human history, the Hebrew Bible.
The Bible was the first book. And you can argue it's good history writing or bad history writing. I think it's extraordinarily remarkable history writing for humans first time out. But it is the first. It's the first time humans set down a story like that through many generations. And the fact that we did it so well the first time out and that it impacted for so long is, it's a wonder.
The scribes were driven by what they saw as a sacred mission, to bring the lessons taught by the stories alive for their fellow exiles, so they would understand why they were in Babylon and how they could get home to Jerusalem. Their book was a guide to how the Judean exiles should live, not a literal history.
Many skeptics today want to ask, are the stories in the Hebrew Bible true in any sense? They are true in some senses and not in others. In other words, the biblical writers want to expand upon events to shed light upon their meaning as they understood that meaning. We moderns say, but wait a minute, we want to know what really happened. So for us, skeptical or not, the question is often, can stories which are not true in every detail nevertheless be morally edifying? My answer is yes. The Bible does not have to be literally true in every detail to be true in other senses.
The Judahites, or Jews as they now became known, were led by priests, and one of them played an absolutely critical role in the history of the Bible. This priest gathered together the various Jewish texts which were still remembered and put them into an official compilation known as the Torah. Richard Friedman believes this priest was called Ezra.
He's a priest, he's a scribe, he has access to the texts, and he's someone who has power because he's someone who's strong enough to come to the Jews and say, okay, this is the Bible from now on, this is Torah. And he stands the people up and they hold a tremendous ceremony, and he has the priests stand up and read the text of the Torah. And that Torah that he created, the 5 books of Moses, is the Torah that everybody has read for 2,500 years since that time.
The year was 458 BC. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and in many ways its core, was later supplemented by further texts. These collective works have come down to us as the Old Testament. From their own complex and difficult history, the Israelites had wrought a document that is still influencing the world.
The Bible is, of course, the most important creation of the Israelites ever. It is the most wonderful and rich literary creation ever created. I think it's still the bestseller, isn't it? It's the best sold book until this very day.
It's this continuing influence, particularly in moral debates, that makes the Old Testament's reliability as history still a matter of importance. Professor Finkelstein and Neil Silberman have shown that not every story or word of the Old Testament can be literally true, and that as history it has to be carefully interpreted. But their objective is not to undermine or dismiss deeply held beliefs.
Despite all the controversy, what we are doing is creating that archaeological story that goes in parallel with the still very profound and cherished biblical tradition.
What we are trying to do, what we wish to do, is not to discard, the biblical text, but to make a distinction between tradition, which is important to all of us, and scientific research. This, I think, is a central piece in what we wish to do. Put this distinction between the two. Tradition is important. Archaeology cannot trash the tradition. Archaeology cannot destroy tradition, because tradition has life of itself.
We're not saying that one is correct and one is incorrect any more than we would say that the poetry of Genesis is incorrect now that we know a bit about human evolution. What we're doing is just continuing a struggle, a scholarly struggle that's been going on for 100 years. The boundary just now happens to be in the story of the Israelites and the Israelite kingdom. And it's moving forward slowly to separate religious literature and spirituality from what we call history.
Modern scholarship is showing then that the Old Testament was a human and highly partisan construct. This does not, however, take away its power or enduring moral force. Indeed, in many ways, it makes the achievement of those who wrote the Old Testament all the more remarkable.
Sometimes when I see how great it is that there was a source that pictured God as very heavenly and universal, and another pictured God as the God of your Father, very close and personal. But then they come together and you get a Bible about a God who is universal and also close. It's God who created the universe and God of your Father. To me, this is a great thing, but I still haven't really come to understand how it worked out so well. We're not talking about one author sitting down and designing something so it comes out nicely at the end. We're talking about 100, 150 authors in the whole Bible writing, and you get a story that flows and works so well and makes such sense and has consistency in it that to me that is, I hesitate to use the word, but a miracle.
All right. Meron po kayong tanong so far sa presentation?
Galing. Very informative po.
Okay.
Dapat yan yung pinapanood ng mga Bible literaristic eh. Yung mahilig na akala pag nabasa literal ka agad. Dapat yun ang pinanonood nila.
Very good, very good.
Pero yung pa naman yung master yung the conclusion, no?
Yeah.
Or the conclusion made by the
Galing.
archaeologists.
Napapanood mo.
Yung conclusion nila, it's still they are not defuncting the belief, but they try to understand it in their own way.
Yep.
So yung the only one word that was used that for me is a complete surrender of them na hindi nila naintindi lahat is it's a miracle. That it was written by so many people, so concise, and that in so long that it was transferred from one scroll to another written bale, ay hindi rin nila masabi na hindi totoo ito. So the last word of it's a miracle it is their belief, Bale. They are not debunking their belief. They believe in it. They believe in God. But they are trying to find a middle ground in terms of their knowledge sa archaeology.
Okay. So, gaya ng
Kasi,
sinabi,
Sir Rusty, kasi po, no, na medyo, kumbaga, patuloy pa rin sila nag-i-study. Bakit ito inspired ng Diyos? Sa kabila na